thank you all for being here. Our first speaker is Silindir. She was born in Gaziantep in 1988 and she lives in Ankara. She's a graduate of Gaziantep College Foundation Private Schools with a scholarship. She completed her undergraduate education as a scholarship student at Ankara University in the Department of English Language and Literature in 2009. She also received her English language teaching certificate. She ranked among the top 3 students in the department. She was appointed to Kilis 7 Aralık University in 2009 as a research assistant in the Department of Western Languages and Literatures. Currently, she is doing her master's degree at Ankara University in the Department of English Language and Literature and permitted to complete the course and the seminar period by Kilis 7 Aralık University. She is interested in the comic fiction in the 18th and 20th century British drama, as well as Shakespearean tragedies and restoration comedies. Now she is here to present her paper, Challenging the Status Quo of Women in the Early 20th Century. Now the stage is yours.
Thank you. I am pleased to meet our dear Professor Talat Salman and the other instructors in Bilkent University and our literature friends from English language literature. I am happy to participate in this conference. Thank you. Challenging the status quo of women in the early 20th century. In the early years of the 20th century, women were still like caged birds, imprisoned in wifehood and motherhood. They were striving for personal liberty, equality to men and rights, equal pay, education, especially for suffrage. Although Mary Wollstonecraft, an advocate of women's rights in the 18th century, protested against gender oppression, educational inequality between men and women, and demanded women's rights in her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, the predicament in which women are regarded as inferiors in society couldn't be resolved even until the mid-20th century. During this time, women did not have higher education, did not own property, and were deprived of marital rights, let alone the right to vote. Men dominated almost all aspects of life. Women were decorative, useful in the home, but that's all. They were confined in the kitchen, in which they spent most of their time cooking, doing laundry, and doing house sewing. Oppression of women was a sight that attracted the literary attention of some women writers on both sides of the Atlantic, such as American playwright Susan Glaspell and the English playwright Cecily Hamilton, whose plays, as this paper argues, spoke back to the repression of women in private and public spaces through their construction of willful, strong, and daring female protagonists. Minnie Foster is one of these women, who is deprived of liberty and personal rights, when she turns into Minnie Wright in Trifles, 1916. Susan Glaspell's best-known one-act play, because of the lack of evidence in her husband's murder, Mrs. Wright is the only suspect, arrested and held in prison. But she is not a suspect in the eyes of the sheriff, county attorney, and the neighboring farmer, Mr. Hale. But nonetheless, she is regarded as a convict. These 3 male characters execute with extreme prejudice against the arrested woman without having Mrs. Hale and the sheriff's wife interrogated. While murder is being investigated by the male authorities to find the evidence of the motive, they can't prove it. And males, especially county attorney, degrade the women, and when these 2 women make their way to the kitchen to find some clues for the alleged strangling of Mr. Wright, Mr. Hale says, well, women are used to worrying over trifles. This is just another example of how men underestimate women and treat them as their inferior. However, the women have found the evidence and have revealed the truth through the disordered kitchen, wrecked sewing, and the strangled canary, things that are considered considered trifles by men. When it is turned out to be that John Wright purposefully wrung the neck of the bird, women justify Mrs. Wright in that the cage bird is her only companion because she does not have any children. So it is revealed that Mrs. Wright takes revenge on her husband and kills him by wrapping a rope round his neck. However, the neighboring women do not tell anything about the evidence to the authorities. This is a women's solidarity. Veronica Makowski suggests at this point, quote, "The women display female solidarity by concealing the dead bird, their conclusions from the men. The sympathy of Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters arises not only from sisterly solidarity, but from the two women's self-identification as mothers. In contrast to the childless Minnie, love, particularly maternal love, is associated with sound and its absence with silence. They realized that the pet was a kind of child substitute for the solitary Minnie. The canary's voice was to displace the silence of a coldly authoritarian husband and replace the sounds of unborn children. Their maternal feelings not only helped Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters understand the importance of the canary to the Minnie, but also helped them direct their solicitude toward Mrs. Wright herself through the memory of Minnie as a vulnerable, pretty young girl who loved singing in the choir." Unquote. Men inevitably and commonly change the lifestyle of women. Minnie Foster was used to singing in the choir, so she didn't enjoy silence, because she had no children, but keeping a canary was even hindered by her husband. However, she just wanted her bird to break the deathly silence at home. Instead of living the manner of life, John Wright reduced his wife to silence, triggered his wife to run out of patience. While using a metaphor or the bird song as the voice of the soul, the women acknowledged that John Wright had not only killed Minnie's canary, but her very spirit. As it is obvious in the play, women were taken for granted as they were supposedly born in order to obey men according to the order of nature. Notwithstanding all the negative conditions women bear up, Susan Glaspell wrote this play to put a lid on sexual inequality and restriction of women's liberty, and also to initiate women's solidarity. Interestingly, the plot of the play echoes a real-life conviction story that occurred at the turn of the century. Margaret Hossack had been accused of bludgeoning her husband to death with an axe while he slept, and although there was no conclusive evidence, she was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. When Susan Glaspell went to see the crime scene, Hossack farmhouse, she found out that the convicted older woman had been beaten to death by her husband. This story might have triggered Glaspell to draw the scene of Bleak Kitchen and the women's social condition in the early 20th century. These years could also be described as a struggle of disposing of being under the sway of male-dominated playwriting. Susan Glaspell, on the one hand, tries to prove herself as a playwright, on the other hand, struggles to earn women's rights. About Glaspell's situation, Annette Colombi has written that Glaspell is also exploring the plight of the women writer. Her trifles are as unnoticed and unappreciated by her culture that, as are many domestic artifacts by the investigating men. Susan Glaspell also experienced the position of other in playwriting, because at the time of the early 20th century in America, women playwrights were still not welcome. Although Glaspell had 9 novels, 50 short stories, 14 plays, she was not acknowledged in American dramatic and literary canon. Martha Carpenter summarizes women's secondary importance as writers in Susan Glaspell, New Directions in Critical Inquiry. Explains the other position of women writers as follows, quote, Paul Lauter has given some answers to the inevitable question of why, one being gender, of course. From the 1920s through the 1950s, in America, women were systematically excluded from academia. while the American canon was sanctified by male literary critics, trained in formalism and seeking to establish an assertive national identity through an indigenous literature reflecting the professoria's concern that a truly American art be attracted to, embody the values of masculine culture. However, Glaspell did not surrender. On the contrary, she, as a rebel, broke the gender norms and became a journalist. In the early 20th century, she dedicated herself to a life of writing. Feminist theater and cultural historians and biographers have resurrected the pivotal role Glaspell played in the most important innovative moment in American theater, with the Provincetown Players, 1915-1922. Unlike the passive resistance of her characters in Trifles, Susan Glaspell rebelled against the injustices and otherness that women confront in American society. Thus, towards the mid-20th century, America tried hard to get women's social, political, economic rights by means of feminist efforts. These feminist efforts were cross-continental. Around the late 19th century and the early 20th century in England, women's liberation movement interested in the British theatre. Similarly, in America, feminist activity provided women with job opportunities, at least changed the social status of women. Linda Kerber, who is an American historian and a writer of women's history, makes pivotal statement in Women's America. While the number of women in the workforce continued to rise from less than 20% in 1920 to a projected 87% by 2000, working women in the 1970s and 1980s saw the gap between male and female income remain virtually unchanged. By the 1998, female workers earned 76 cents for every dollar earned by males. Although the gap has substantially narrowed among younger women, part of the explanation for this persistent gap lies in pay inequities. More fundamental, however, is the continuation of occupational segregation and the undervaluation of work done by women. Around 80% of all working women still cluster in gender-segregated occupations in which wages are artificially low. That women made up 2/3 of all minimum wage workers in the United States is therefore hardly surprising. Unquote. Just as America was suffering from pay inequalities during the 20th century, England was also challenging against the low payment in the early years of the 20th century. Feminists of that period contested to take their personal rights. Among those who actively challenged the relegation of women to a private, domesticated world were a number of self-consciously feminist playwrights who used the overtly public form of drama as a point of entry to the debate. As Stowell asserts, Cicely Hamilton is one of those feminist and suffragist playwrights who used playwriting as a vehicle for expression of the female enfranchisement in England. Suffrage plays in British drama flourished in 1908 and led the suffragettes together in an organization named as the Women Writers' Suffrage League and the Actresses' Franchise League. These organizations argued against not granting to the women the right to vote. Cicely Hamilton, whose plays and pageants were among the most potent weapons in the Actresses' Franchise League arsenal, and who was an articulate speaker for the suffrage cause, depicted in Diane of Dobson's 1908 the conditions of women in employment, marriage, and law. The protagonist of the play, Diana Messingburg, is a rebellious and impoverished character who struggles to be paid equally as men and fights against low wages. Diana, like the other middle-class women, suffers from overwork as a shop assistant in a large drapery. All the shop girls have to live and work in the dormitory attached to the drapery. The women work under harsh conditions to earn their own living by themselves. However, they are not paid as they deserve, or the same amount as men. Hamilton, in this sense, argues that, although it may be unseemly to point it out, women, like men, must eat. To eat, they must have money. To have money, they must either have a man to support them, or else adequate employment so they can earn a living on their own. The preservation of the human race, with which so many men exclusively associate women, depends entirely upon women's own preservation. Clementine Black defines sweating in her book, Sweated Industry, the Minimum Wage, as any method of work under which workers are extremely ill paid and extremely overworked. As Black says, Diana and the other women work for excessive hours and force them to toil under insanitary conditions. Says Hamilton. Diana realizes that the employers gain advantage from the young women, so this results in cheap labor, which leads to austerity. Diana says, "Oh, that's the way to make money." Diana of Dobson's Act 2nd. So the living-in system, the cheap labor, are the substantial problems of the society. As a result, Virginia Woolf says, a room of one's own. An independent income enables a woman to say and write what she thinks. A financially independent woman can conclude, "He has nothing to give me." As a historical fact, the victory of women enfranchisement was achieved in England in 1918. On the other hand, America's victory was in 1920, with the passage of 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Until the triumph of the women, they were seen as passive beings, not having right to speech, not having right to vote, not having right to bear testimony to the justice. In fact, they were not living as human beings. Both Minnie Wright and Diana had common burdens because of their gender, though they lived in different countries, one in America, the other in England, and at different periods in the 20th century. However, their unjust treatment in public and private spaces is what brings these protagonists under the same umbrella. Minnie Wright was deprived of the right to live by committing murder. She was already imprisoned in home, so being put into jail did not indicate much difference to her, as she was already deprived of her freedom in her home. To live in jail was therefore not hard for her. Perhaps this is why she ventures murder. In Diana's case, she was confined to dormitory and the drapery store because it was economic conditions which hindered the lifestyle she longed for. Throughout the history of women, undergoing problem is not that women did not want rights, much more they deserve, or they desire. The problem was that women were not granted existing rights as it should be. As a result, there became a huge gap between men and women in terms of social, economic, political, and legal status until the suffrage was granted. I would like to conclude my paper with a quote from Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which arguably summarizes what Minnie and Diana aspired to achieve. Quote, "I then would fain convince reasonable men of the importance of some of my remarks, and prevail on them to weigh dispassionately the whole tenor of my observations. I appeal to their understandings, and as a fellow creature, claim in the name of my sex some interest in their hearts. I entreat them to assist to emancipate their companion, to make her a helpmeet for them. Would men but generously snap our chains, be content with rational fellowship instead of slavish obedience? they would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better still. Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you for this very inspiring paper. And if you have any questions, you can ask now.
Are there any questions to ask? All in all, I wanted to just focus on the similarity between the Americas and England's same problem, the problem of not granting the suffrage to the women, because women in the early 20th century, especially 1980s and the 1920s, they couldn't give votes, and they didn't also bear testimony to the sheriff, or because their voice, their words are not worthy. They were seen as inferiors to the men. Thank you for listening. I am pleased to participate in this conference. Thank you for the organization and the Gülten University to give opportunity to just give a presentation. Okay, have a nice